to a flashback in time where we will talk about British Romanticism. Today we have a guest speaker by the name of Dr. Michael Westbrook. Welcome, Dr. Westbrook. I hear that you're an expert on British Romanticism.
I am, Tori.
Would you care to share with us some of your credentials?
Yes, I have 97 degrees from Harvard University, 97 degrees from Oxford University. I have won 297 Nobel Peace Prizes, and I've also lived in England since I had the tail on the end of May.
Well, good to know. Now let's start with some questions. First, how about you tell us about the role that religion played in society?
Well, religion was unique during the Romanticism age. They believed more in the spirit world than they did in actual religion. They took peace and comfort in knowing that nature was a spirit and that they intertwined together, and that's what they based most of their writings on at the time.
Great. Next, did religion undergo any kind of evolution during this time?
I wouldn't say so, but they definitely didn't focus on what they did in the medieval time period, where it was horror and macrobee and supernatural energy. It was more beauty than anything else.
We are now taking questions from the audience.
Who were the main writers during the Romantic time period?
That was a very interesting question. Some of the most notable writers of the time period were William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, William Blake, and Lord Byron. And those are only a few that came out of the Romanticism age.
So, share with us how the government was set up during this time.
Well, there still was a king. There was a king of England during this time. As you know, King George III ruled from 1760 to 1820. George IV ruled from 1820 to 1830. And William IV, which was King George's fourth son, ruled from 1830 to 1837 before he was overthrown by the British people.
Great. How is the economy set up, and what is the social impact?
Well, see, they often described during this time period, England was two nations. There were the rich privileged who owned the industrial aspect, because that was going on in England at the time. They were just beginning the Industrial Revolution and how to manufacture goods. And then the second nation are the poor and the powerless people, the peasants, who had to move from agriculture to industrial work because they weren't finding any work. So you could say that there was kind of not a caste system, but a system that divided the two, and that the rich and privileged ran the country.
Great. So the writers of this time period, were they a part of the rich and privileged, or the...
Definitely not the rich and privileged. I mean, you had some, but they were the rebels at the time that were trying to expose industrial life, and that they wanted to get back in touch with beauty and nature. So they definitely wouldn't be a part of the industrial age. They wanted to go back to things and to appreciate beauty how it was before all of that happened.
Natural beauty.
Yes, natural beauty.
Great. So, go for a commercial break. Welcome back to a flashback in time with expert on British Romanticism, Dr. Michael Westbrook. Now, we talked about the government and religion. How about you tell us about some of the significant events that happened through England and Europe during this time?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, Tori, because the French Revolution was a major factor in the time period. They saw the pain and the suffering the French were going through, and they felt like their writings were to help avoid something like that. Because remember, I had previously mentioned that they were trying to connect back with nature. And so that's what the French Revolution was about, was the difference in power. And I had also said the difference in social classes. So they felt like they were contributing in a relief effort to help curb some of those oppositions to power and to powerful people.
Okay. What were some of the gender norms or relations?
Well, girls were just definitely not equal with their social counterparts, not by a long shot. Girls did not get an education, even whether they were poor or not. It was really hard for them to get an education. They wanted to write, especially in writers. I'm going to focus on writers. They wanted to, even though they got the education sometimes, they definitely did not enjoy the success that their male counterparts do. They were equal, but they were not equal. Because they got books published, but they weren't as understood and they weren't as heard.
Okay. And were times as progressive as they are today?
Not at all. The word shopping actually came around. That was invented specifically for women, and that's what they did with their leisure time, especially rich women. They were expected to go shopping on their husband's dime. They weren't held in any kind of office or any kind of public forum. They held no position in society other than to take care of the children and the house and to shop all day. That's what they did. It was like the Real Housewives of England at the time. That's all they did. And I would definitely argue that some of the best female writers came out of this time.
Could you give some examples?
Jane Austen, for one, we all read her literature. Most classes in America, England, all across the world study what she has written, and she was a writer that came out of this time period. But during the time, interesting fact, her work was tossed aside as an unimportant or unheard of. Nobody had heard of what message she was trying to display.
Okay. So, and when you discuss the industrial period, the revolution, were the lower class, the women, did they help during this time period? Did they work there?
They actually were allowed to work, but once again, held no kind of position. They were at the lowest of low position, the yarn factories. The things basically you needed to survive is what they worked. They were paid very, very cheap. The labor was very intensive, not as intensive as the male counterparts. Well, I would even argue as intensive as the male counterpart, just in a different way. They worked with their fingers and to make sure that their family was provided for, and then they had to go home and to work because that was still expected of them. So in some sense of the word, I feel like, well, yes, maybe they were more productive than their male counterparts, but they weren't seen as socially equal.
That's understandable. And how did the Romantics of this time period express themselves?
Ooh, through a plethora of ways, a plethora. There was, the novel genre grew tremendously during this time. And that was, once again, not as looked up to as poetry. Poetry was huge. It was huge. Huge! I'm stressing it because that is some of the only work that came out of this time. Of course, they had novels and storybooks and paintings, but it was called the Romantics for a reason. When people say poem, they automatically associate it with romantic. And that's what came out of this time, poems, so huge amounts of poems.
in these poems, did they express the natural and beauty?
Yes, they compared love to the natural beauty of the world. Like I said, they believed that something existed out there in their religion. It just wasn't the traditional sense that the earth had some impact on what they were doing.
Education play a role?
Well, everybody wanted to be educated, and they did have the access to it. Lower and middle class families who wanted to read drew dramatically. They had access to the education and were allowed to go get that education. And writers became aware of their position in the marketplace, that people wanted to read and share the expression of how beauty of the world affected them. So that was a really good thing that came out of the Romanticism period, is because the lower and middle classes did have access, as to prior where they did not, to the marketplace, and the writers definitely knew that. That's why there was such a flood in the market of language and literature, poems, sonnets, everything. All right, go. Now do your intro. Exit.
Oh, and you do the image thing?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Now that we have discussed some of the interesting facts of the British Romanticism period, we will show some images of pictures of the natural beauty and poems that were written during this time period. Thank you for joining us on A Flashback in Time starring Tori Brown. Join us next week where we will talk about ancient Greece.